This video is going to be about the character of the sergeant in Macbeth. He appears in Act 1, Scene 2. "What bloody man is that?" says King Duncan as the sergeant approaches, and he gives to King Duncan a report of his captains, Macbeth and Banquo's victory over Duncan's foe, the Norwegians. It's a scene that's often cut or cut down in performance, I guess because it amounts to exposition, an exposition about a foe who has been dealt with and we're not going to be seeing again in the play. Movies often adhere to the show don't tell rule and cut the speech and replace it with a battle sequence. I'm yet to see one that trumps the impact of the sergeant's speech. Battle sequences in Macbeth are very much of a type. If you've seen Braveheart or if you've seen, King Arthur movies, you know what these battles look like. It's men charging at each other, shouting like a bear. They do the stab and yell. They do the pull the sword out of the foe with another bear-like yell, and then they hold their sword up over their heads and shout their own name, and for good measure throw in a few more bear-like yells. It's gripping stuff, and it never gets monotonous. I would say, though, that it's a shame to lose the speech. No amount of physical action can be more memorable than a line like the sergeant's talking about Macbeth's blade smoking with bloody execution as he carves out his passage throughout the foes. And more than just exposition, it also sets a tone. It's a very ominous sort of speech. Instead of just footage of Macbeth sort of yodeling into battle, we get a sense of him from the sergeant's quite decorative language. Macbeth and Banquo, I guess, are kind of loose cannons. They're discharging like the double cracks of cannon fire, he says. They're kind of overpowered, they're unstable, almost suicidal. They are throwing themselves into battle just to bathe in reeking wounds, he says, to memorize another Golgotha. So the fact that the import of the sergeant's message is good news for Duncan, it doesn't change the fact that it's still ominous and sinister. Duncan has heard the sense of the message, but he's missed the sound. So it's a short part, but it's dense and quite elaborate. And one of my bugbears with it in performance is that if it's not cut, it's often ruined by this weird tradition that some productions have of making this sergeant, sometimes called a captain, but we'll say sergeant, far, far too wounded. Now, this might sound like a weird quibble to have, but, and to be fair, we don't quite know how wounded the sergeant is. The text, Duncan says, "What bloody man is that?" So we can imagine him coated in blood, and he has to be sort of helped off at the end. He says, "My gashes cry for aid, cry for help." So for all we know, he is mortally wounded, but he has a lot to say, and he doesn't say it in a direct, urgent way. He doesn't speak in prose like the porter. He speaks in quite ornate verse that's quite digressive with its imagery. In other words, it doesn't have the ring of, a dispatch. He does not stick to the bare essentials. And unfortunately, often when you see it on stage or in films, the actor playing the sergeant is having far too much fun being severely wounded. I mean, actors love nothing more than a mortal injury. They'll literally kill for a mortal wound to get to dribble blood, cough foam out of the lungs, soil themselves, all that stuff, thrash around. But when you do that kind of thing, when you're trying to perform a fairly sophisticated chunk of verse, it sort of spoils it. And I've lost count of the amount of times I've seen an actor just spoil the whole speech by yelling through it, spluttering, soiling themselves, that kind of thing. Classic example would be the Patrick Stewart film, which I think is brilliant. It's from about 2010. I've talked about it before in an earlier video. Brilliant, love the film, but it does start on quite shaky ground, literally shaky ground. It starts with a lot of shaky cam and lens flare, so some of the visual cliches of the last decade. And it also starts with the sergeant, who is a classic scream through his speech, thrash around, spit blood. And that sort of method dying doesn't really fit very well with Shakespearean verse. I mean, the sergeant begins his field report with a simile about the two sides being even, being like two spent swimmers who choke their art by clinging to each other. So he's not exactly direct. So how then to square that eloquence and verbal energy with being wounded at all? I mean, even if you're not mortally wounded, you're not going to necessarily feel like talking in such a way. And the ways I've seen it done that I thought were really impressive were kind of fall into two camps. And the first is that the sergeant, if he is mortally wounded, is experiencing a sort of final burst of energy that some people close to death have, which fits with the idea of a kind of man of duty. He's got a checklist, perhaps adrenaline has taken over, and then this verbosity and elaboration to his speech sort of comes out in an almost sort of manic burst, a kind of a river's last charge before he collapses. And the other way is kind of going completely the other route in terms of energy. Instead of it being this sort of burst, it's instead almost like the steely clarity that's coming to him at the end. And he delivers his speech with all of its digressions, almost as if he's seeing it all in the long view. He's taking it all in, the landscape of his last few hours, and delivering his final word in almost like a prayer-like hush. And that will bring in the other actors and help emphasize that the ominous side of this speech, which is a really effective way of building up to the entrance of the as yet unseen Macbeth. So yeah, that's it, I think. A few thoughts on the Sergeant from Macbeth. If you have a favourite performance of the Sergeant on film or on stage, let me know in the comments below. Cheers.